The female reproductive system is amazing, not only in its ability to control female reproduction, but also to allow the development of the next generation of humans. Today, we're going to start our discussion of the female reproductive system, and we're going to start with the structures of the female reproductive system. So the female reproductive system is responsible for the reception of sperm from the male, the production of an egg, nourishing and protecting the fetus, as well as delivering a baby. So the female reproductive system is mainly internal with a few external parts. So externally, we have the inner and outer labia, also known as the labia majora and labia minora, the urethral opening, the clitoris. Inside the body is the vagina, the cervix, the uterus, as well as the ovary and fallopian tube. Often on diagrams, you'll see the bladder, but make sure you're differentiating between the bladder and the uterus. The bladder typically will be between the pubic bone and the uterus. So the labia majora are the larger, typically fatty or fleshy hair-covered folds that protect the genitals. And again, this is going to keep any kind of pathogens, bacteria, particles out of the vagina as much as possible and out of the urethra. The labia minora are smaller folds of skin inside the labia majora that are typically kept moist by our vaginal secretions. And then the clitoris, which is a small shaft of erectile tissue. The vagina is not the entire female reproductive structure, but a canal that will accept the penis during intercourse. It becomes the birth canal during labor, and generally the pH is acidic. So it's kind of like a hallway in the female reproductive system for things to go in or out. The cervix is a ring of thick muscular tissue that typically plugs closed with mucus during pregnancy. In general, it prevents material from getting into the uterus to prevent infections. It will hold the baby in. And this is where blood and tissue will flow out of during menstruation. The uterus is a pear-shaped organ, typically about 5 centimeters wide, that will grow during pregnancy to contain the developing fetus. It's muscular and will have strong contractions during labor to help push the baby out. The main body of the uterus is known as the fundus, and the inner layer of the uterus is known as the endometrium, where there are lots of blood vessels, tissues, and mucus. And this is the layer that is expelled during menstruation every month. And surgeries of the female reproductive system include a hysterectomy, which would be the removal of a uterus in the case of cancer or other disorders that might be causing problems for a female. Internally, females also have ovaries. This is where the ovum or eggs are produced from follicles. And this is also where the estrogen and progesterone are produced. The fallopian tubes conduct the egg from the ovaries to the uterus. An important point, this is where fertilization normally takes place. So fertilization will take place in the fallopian tube. This is where the sperm meets the egg. If a fertilized egg implanted in the fallopian tube, it's an ectopic pregnancy, and it can be very serious for the female in the case of a ruptured tube. The end of the fallopian tube contains fimbriae, which are small finger-like projections at the end of the fallopian tubes, and these will help draw the egg into the fallopian tube because the fallopian tubes aren't actually directly connected to the ovaries. There's kind of like a little bit of a floating space there. The equivalent of a vasectomy for females is a tubal ligation. This is where the fallopian tubes are severed so that the egg that's released from the ovary can't meet up with any sperm that may have entered the uterus. So when we're looking at different structures in the ovary, because it has its own structural system, we have follicles. Now, these are cells that support and protect the developing ovum or egg, and they'll secrete estrogen to help mature that ovum. After ovulation, they become a structure known as a corpus luteum, which will produce progesterone following ovulation. So the ovum will be the egg cell, and it's viable for about 24 hours after ovulation. And that's about the time that it can be fertilized in. The corpus luteum is what the follicle turns into after ovulation, and it will secrete progesterone and small amounts of estrogen for about 14 days if fertilization does not occur, but for about 3 months if fertilization and pregnancy occurs. So that fertilized egg will then release HCG or human chorionic gonadotropin, and this tells the corpus luteum to stay in place and secrete progesterone, which will allow the pregnancy to be maintained. So here we can see both the structure of the ovary as well as the process of oogenesis or egg formation. So on the bottom left, we can see the early primary follicle. And so women are born with a certain number of these because all of a female's eggs are grown when she is still a fetus in her mother's body. And that's a primary follicle. And several of these will start to develop every cycle. And then we have a late primary follicle. And by this point, a few of the early primaries have dropped off. And then it becomes a secondary follicle. It will fully mature and ovulate. And women will typically ovulate only one egg a month. Occasionally, women will ovulate more than one egg. And in this case, if there was two and they were both fertilized and both became fetuses, she would be pregnant with fraternal twins, or twins that came from two separate fertilized eggs. Moving around to the top after ovulation, there is a corpus luteum that is formed that will produce progesterone to maintain the uterine lining in the case of pregnancy. And if a pregnancy occurs, it will maintain itself for about 3 months. If not, it will degenerate after about 14 days. And this is when a woman's menstrual cycle would begin. So in the case of sperm during meiosis 1 and meiosis 2, one germ cell or spermatocyte would produce 4 different sperm. But in eggs, one germ cell will produce only one mature egg and 3 polar bodies, which don't have the opportunity to be fertilized and don't develop into viable eggs because the egg needs a lot of cytoplasm to be viable. So we can see that there's a vast size difference between the one mature egg cell and then the very much smaller haploid bodies. And this is an uneven division of the cytoplasm, but it allows the female reproductive system to provide enough cytoplasm for that egg cell to survive and divide until it embeds in the uterine lining. So controlling the reproductive regulation of the female reproductive system is similar hormones as the male reproductive system. We have gonadotropic releasing hormone from the anterior pituitary, from the hypothalamus to the anterior pituitary, which will then produce follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. Now, follicle stimulating hormone is going to develop the follicles in the ovary, and with it, the production of estrogen. Luteinizing hormone peaks, causing ovulation, and then the development of the corpus luteum, which is then going to secrete progesterone. So estrogen is secreted by the follicles in the ovaries, and it causes the maturation of eggs. It stimulates the growth of the uterine lining, the endometrium, and it's also responsible for female secondary sex characteristics such as breast development, fat deposits on the hips, body hair in the armpits and the groin area, and the initiation of the menstrual cycle. It also, high levels of estrogen will inhibit the release of follicle stimulating hormone so that further eggs are not developed during a menstrual cycle. Progesterone is secreted by the corpus luteum, and this continues the preparation of the endometrium and inhibits both follicle stimulation and luteinizing hormone, so we further prevent the release of more eggs, or through development or through ovulation. Progesterone also prevents uterine contractions, which allows if a fertilized egg, more chance to embed itself in the uterine lining, as well as firming the cervix, which again would help maintain an early pregnancy. So this is a negative feedback cycle for the female reproductive system. So we see there the hypothalamus will release gonadotropic releasing hormone to stimulate the anterior pituitary to release both follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. Now, follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone will both stimulate the growing follicle to produce estrogen and or luteinizing hormone just prior to ovulation. High levels of estrogen then will go back and tell the anterior pituitary to decrease its release of follicle stimulating hormone because levels of estrogen are also high. Then luteinizing hormone will also stimulate the development of the corpus luteum, which will increase the amount of progesterone, and again inhibit the release of follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone after ovulation. So that is our lesson on the structure and control of the female reproductive system. See you guys next time.